Hello everyone, welcome to another tutorial. Today, as the title suggests, we will be talking about securing your first RHEL-based server, whether it's CentOS, Amazon Linux, Oracle Linux. The steps should more or less all be the same. Really any systemd-based Linux distribution. The only difference might be names of packages or package managers, yum, apt, etc. If you are looking for PCI DSS compliance, I believe CentOS has an option when you're initially installing it during the provisioning phase where you can apply a policy. If you're uncertain what that is, it just stands for Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard. But you don't need to worry about that too much. This will just be a basic configuration of SELinux, changing ports, configuring SSH, fail2ban, etc. Whether you're setting up your first server or a golden image to deploy in an environment, whatever it may be. And as always, there is a written guide in the description on my website. I know some people don't really like watching these types of videos, so if you'd prefer something more direct, you can just copy paste from or read, skip over, etc. Maybe you know all this. That will be available. So, the first things first, you should see your login screen. You'll likely be in a console of some sort instead of logged in over SSH, whether you spun up your server via ESXi, VirtualBox, maybe AWS, Azure, you're in the cloud, who knows. Once you have it installed and provisioned, go ahead and pull up the console and log in initially as, depending on the install process, it may have had you create a user. In our case, I didn't create any, just so we can build things from the ground up. Go ahead and log in. I did log in just before to disable a few things that we will be re-enabling, but usually you won't see a last login message. If you hit Control L, it's a shortcut for clear, which will clear the screen. In any case, the first thing we'll do is check for SELinux. We'll be enabling this. If you're not familiar with what SELinux is, it is just short for Security Enhanced Linux. And there is a lot to it, but at a very high level, it essentially just gives you admins a very granular and strict control over who and what can access certain parts of the system. It was originally developed by the NSA. There's a lot more depth to it than that, but for now, that's all you really need to know. If you run the get-enforce command, it will tell you the current running state. There are 3 states: enforcing, disabled, and permissive. Permissive will log SELinux policy violations and things like that, but it won't actually prevent applications from accessing certain things, which can be useful. But we're going to go ahead and set that to enforcing. To do so, you have to go into etc SELinux config, and I typed that incorrectly. Probably be seeing a lot of that in this video. And go ahead down to SELinux where it says disabled and change it to enforcing. If you are using Vi and you haven't before, to insert into a text file, you press the I key. It will switch it to insert mode. Then you can type backspace, etc. To close out and save the document, you will then hit escape, shift : W for write, Q for quit. That will save and quit the file. There are other methods of manipulating files via Emacs, Nano, etc. Whatever suits your fancy. And then we'll go ahead and reboot. Wait for it to come up. Sometimes with SELinux, if you aren't used to using it, it is good to check in the logs and things whether or not SELinux was the problem. Usually you'll have to adjust some policy to give an application access. As an example, sometimes with like JVMs or other memory applications like MongoDB, if you expand the memory on the system from 8 gigs to 12 gigs or something, and then you allow the service access to that memory, it may throw a policy violation trying to access C groups. That actually happened to me the other weekend, in which case you just add a custom policy for it. So some things like that. There are a number of gotchas that can crop up, things just to be aware of. But ultimately, once you get used to it, SELinux, knock on wood, really isn't too bad. Definitely worth having installed. It is a great tool, great for keeping your system secure. I highly recommend you leave it enabled and enforcing, and do not disable it. It can be a pain to work with sometimes, but it is well worth it. So we'll go ahead once it's rebooted, and let's see if I can type this right. Make sure it's enforcing. There we go. So pretty simple with that one. Next, I usually like to, before I turn on networking, disable ICMP echo requests. This is just so when someone pings your server, it won't echo a reply. Particularly, I try and do this before, bots and things find the server. Not a huge deal if they do, but it's just one security measure I like to add. Up to you whether or not you'd like to. But anyways, what you'll go do is go into etc sysctl.conf, and at the bottom here we're going to add in to ignore all ICMP echo requests for IPv4. So you just scroll to the bottom, type net.ipv4.icmp underscore echo underscore ignore underscore all space equals 1. Now type sysctl-p to load the value, and that is it. So next, one of the more integral parts, I'm going to go ahead and set up networking. So if we look, we can see ENS 192 is our interface. If you're used to the more older conventional IPA, we'll also show you your interfaces. So we're going to do nmcli con, short for connection, mod, short for modify, and the interface name, ENS 192. We're going to change the IPv4 address, so we'll give it, in my case, 10.10.5.14, followed by the netmask, depending on your use case. If this is just at home in your basic network, it'll probably be something like 192.168. Whatever you want to put. If you are using DHCP instead, you can just do nmcli con up ENS 192. But if you're going to give it a dedicated IP, you should go about it this way, and then it'll just be followed by the minute mask, in my case /24. Next, we're going to specify the gateway IP or the router IP. It should just be essentially the same as your IP address, but the last octet, instead of whatever number you designated, it'll be a 1. In most people's cases, if this is on your home network, it will just be 192.168.1.1, but it does depend, and obviously if you're in a cloud environment or something else, it will differentiate. Next, we're going to set it to come up on reboot, so we'll set connection auto connect equal to yes, and I'm just double checking I spelled everything correctly because I do not want to retype this. Alright, I think that took, let's do nmcli con up ENS 192 and cross our fingers. Hey, it came up, and if we want, we can do it to quick test. Ping google.com, count 3 times, Q for the quiet flag. Just make sure 3 received, 0% packet loss. Fantastic. Now, if you don't do the minimal install, I believe it will automatically install the bash completion package. Presently that is not installed, but with NMCLI and other tools, you can just hit tab and it'll prompt you for the next input, things like that. Makes it much easier to type commands and much quicker. We will be installing that later, but before we do anything else, I'm going to go ahead and turn on the firewall. For CentOS Rails 7 and above, it's firewall D. So if we do systemctl enable -- now firewall D, it will automatically enable it so it restarts on a reboot and starts it as well. So let's see if it's running. Awesome. By default, on most installs, it should already be running, but double check. You never know. Sometimes it isn't, and you definitely want a firewall. But then again, if you have a firewall in front on your router, or depending on your enterprise, you might not need it on the devices specifically, but I always recommend leaving it on. By default, firewall D should have a number of rules already pre-configured. Pretty much everything except for DHCP and SSH is blocked, and I think a couple other services like DNS, etc. So after we enable the firewall, we have networking up. We're going to head and update our system with Rails CentOS. It's just yum update. If you're on Ubuntu, apt update upgrade or apt-get upgrade. This is probably one of the more important aspects that is very surprising. A lot of enterprises do not do. It's just keeping everything updated. If you have a few 100,000 servers, obviously it can be a bit more complicated, and you'll have patch management systems, whether it's, I think, SCCM or something for Windows, BigFix, Ansible, Salt Chef, lots of ways you can go about it, satellite, etc. So anyways, just make sure you always stay up to date with your updates, especially when you first provision the machine. Update all the packages. There's a number of bug fixes, security updates. All in all, you want the system in its best and configured state, so make sure you apply those. So now our updates are all complete. That took around 5 minutes or so. Will vary depending on how many updates you have. Next, we're going to go ahead and install Apple Release, a repository that we need to install fail2ban a bit later. And now we're going to go ahead and install a couple other packages. You don't need all of them. They're more of quality of life. We mentioned this one earlier, Bask Completion. And then since we have SELinux enabled, SE Troubleshoot, which will be very handy. Fail2ban, which we'll talk about later. And then I personally enjoy using Vim. You don't have to install that. It is my editor, text editor of choice. So we'll go ahead and I typed that wrong. Install those. Touching back on what I mentioned earlier about making sure your system's up to date, you also don't want to just apply only certain types of updates. For instance, you don't only want to apply security fixes. I had a client who, for like 3 years, all they did was apply security patches, while the rest of their system was very, very much out of date. And it started leading to issues just because some dependencies for some packages hadn't been updated in 3 years, and the initial package needed certain functions from those, or at least the package that had been getting security updates, and it left the system just in a very unstable state. So if you can apply all the updates, there may be an update that breaks an application. So typically, depending on your environment, that's where you'd have dev, prod, staging, etc. But if this is just your sole server, maybe this is at home, you have a Minecraft server, I don't know. But I'm a huge advocate for always keeping your system up to date. So we've gone ahead and installed those. Since we had some kernel updates, we're going to go ahead and reboot. You don't always need to reboot for everything. If it's like a microcode or, as we mentioned, kernel update, you'll probably need to reboot. If it's something more simple, like Apache or sysctl, things like that, then you probably don't need to reboot. So we'll go ahead and reboot. Next, we'll create our first user. Then we'll set up SSH keys, add the public. Sorry, my mic just died. But we'll set up, I forgot what I was talking about, SSH, oh yeah, with key login, so we don't have to use passwords, things like that. So it's rebooted. Let's go ahead and log in. So now we're going to add our first user. We'll just do user add, whatever you want your name to be. And now we're going to do password, my user, set the password to something ideally pretty secure. In this episode we won't be talking about PAM, things like that, password policies. But if that's something you're interested in, please let me know in the comments and I will be happy to make a tutorial on it. After we create our user, we're going to add them to the default admin group, which is the wheel group. And then we will configure sudo permissions for it. You can create any other group if you'd want, or you can strictly give sudo access to just your user. By default, the wheel group should already have sudo access. In my case, you can edit the file directly at the sudoers, or at the sudoers.d sudo file. But generally it is much safer to use vsudo, as it will syntax check for any errors. Because if you do break sudoers and you get locked out of root, you're going to have a very bad day. So you'll scroll all the way down to where it says the wheel group. Generally, it's best practice to leave it with no password off. I, just on my personal machines, because they're my machines and it's my home lab, will usually put no password on, but if it's enterprise environment, things like that, you should have a little bit more strict control. There are better things to restrict access than sudo, but if you do need to give them admin permissions, through vsudo is the way you would do it. So now we've done that. We're going to go ahead and hop on to the client side in our terminal, and Notepad+, I will do that later. Generate our SSH keys, copy them over to the server, and do all that fun stuff. You can use whatever terminal or SSH client you would like. The most common used to be PuTTY, but personally I like, I think it was MOBA, There was one I used to use, Mobex term I think was the one that I used to use all the time. But ever since they came out with Bash subsystem for Linux and Windows Terminal, that's been my go-to. But there really is no wrong choice. Putty is a great alternative, whichever you'd like. In any case, if you happen to be using Bash subsystem for Linux or another Linux device, we're going to go ahead and create our keys. So you'll run ssh-keygen. If you would like, you can change the default directory or location. I'm going to leave it as is, and I'm not going to create a passphrase. So I created our keys, and from there we are going to log in with our user and copy our keys to the device so that we don't have to use a password when we log in. So you'll type ssh copy ID my user at the IP that you gave your device. I actually don't remember what IP. I think we gave it 5.14. Okay, yeah, we gave it 5.14. Go ahead and hit enter. Yes, and you'll need to type in your password. And it should copy the keys in. So if we go to sshn once more, it won't prompt us for our password. It will verify our authentication through our SSH keys. Oops, I was confused for a second. I ran the same command. You will SSH, not SSH copy ID. And there you go. Didn't have to type in our password. I won't be explaining how SSH keys work in this episode, but one thing I do want you to take away, there's your public key and your private key. So if we look, it will be typically under your home directory ID RSA. If I can type, and rsa.pub. Does it tell us? Yeah. The main thing is your pub key. Your public key is public. It doesn't matter if anyone sees it. It's what's copied over to the server. The private key is your private key. Never, ever, 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 ever give it to anyone or let them see it. Just never. If that's the one thing you'll take away about SSH keys, please always remember that. So we'll go ahead and SSH in. And we'll do the rest of our configuration through the terminal. I'll go ahead and do sudo. We're going to next secure SSH, change a few options in the config file. We'll essentially be changing the default port from 22. We'll be removing access to root and ensuring that people can't log in with passwords, only with keys. So you'll do sudo vim nano, whatever your text editor is, etc ssh sshd config, and it'll prompt you for your password if you didn't have no password enabled in the sudo or the sudoers file. So you'll scroll ahead down to where it says port, uncomment it, and change it to whatever you like. In my case, 4242. There's no particular reason why. If you're a fan of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, 42, The Answer to Life, kind of where I get it. But in any case, that's the first directive you'll change. Next, you'll find where it says permit root login, change that to no, and then we'll find the next line that says password authentication, and change that to no. If you are using Vim and you can't find it, if you type a backslash and then start typing the word and hit enter, it will search it. If you type a question mark, type the word, it will search up. Backslash searches down. Generally, at least when you're using less, I think in the case of Vim, it'll search up and down whichever search character you use. But good to know if you're having trouble finding it or if you're in a much larger config file. So we're going to go ahead and save that. And then we will restart SSH to make sure that the changes take effect. Actually, first, I almost forgot. Since we have SELinux enabled, we do need to change the port the SSH runs on. Otherwise, it will restrict our access. So, for instance, if you run sudo semanage port-l grep ssh, you can see it's only allowed to run on port 22. And actually, just for the sake of it, I will restart SSH just to give you an idea of what the error looks like. Should fail. And if we look in the logs, we'll say it failed to bind to the port. Let's see. So, fatal, cannot bind any address. The one thing we installed SE Troubleshoot earlier, it is super handy. It will often tell you when there's a policy violation and what it's preventing, and most of the time it will give you a command on how you can enable access, which is pretty handy. So in our case, to grant SSH access through SELinux, we'll use the command semanage port-a-t ssh port -port p for port TCP 4242. I believe that should do it. Must be a port type. Thought I had that syntax. Oh, I forgot the underscore T. Just wait a second. Alright, and go ahead and we should see it change to port 4242. And before we move on, one thing you may have been wondering, the SELinux policy still allowed port 22. If you do try deleting it or removing it with the deflag instead, it'll say like policy blocked, something to that effect. It's not something to really worry about. I understand most people might think, oh, SELinux still has port 22 enabled. If someone gets on the server, they could configure their own service and force it to list on port 22. But that would only be possible if it had the context sshd_t, as the sshd binary does. As an example, like MySQL can't bind to port 22 because it's MySQL_t, I believe, or Apache can't because it's HTTP_t. So the fact that you have 22 and 42 both set as okay for the sshd binary to bind to shouldn't be anything to worry about. If you are really worried, you'd have to build your own policy module for SSH, which I'm not going to go into today. So anyways, after we have done that, restarted the actually we haven't restarted yet. So now we're going to go ahead. I was about to mention the we enabled our firewall earlier, so we'll go ahead and add a rule to it for our new port. In our case with firewall D, we use firewall-command, and then to make it persistent across reboots and restarts, you add the -- permanent flag. If you do not add that flag, it adds the rule, but if you restart the service or the server, then the rule will be gone. And we're going to remove service SSH, just because it's best practice, why not? We aren't using it. And then we're going to go ahead and add port, our new port 42 protocol TCP instead of UDP. And we'll go ahead and reload so that the changes take effect. And if we list all the rules, we should see the port 4242, and typically there would be SSH listed here next to DHCP. So all good there. We're pretty much getting close to being done. The last thing that you can do is set up fail to ban. We're going to just create a really generic config under fail to ban jail.local. There's lots of stuff you can do for fail to ban. Just listens for failed login attempts and will ban them after a certain number of failed tries. You can set it up with SMTP, with databases, Apache logins, but the most common use case is usually sshd. It's really simple, kind of a set it and forget it type thing. In our case, we're using key logins. Password isn't allowed anyways, but it does help get rid of some of the annoying Chinese botnets, things like that, that will inevitably find your server. So we're going to create one for sshd, set it to enabled, set which port it listens on, as well as the ban time in seconds. In my case, I usually set it for 10 days, which is 864,000 seconds. If you want, you can set much lower to like 3,600 seconds, but I usually do about 10 days. Obviously, in your case, you might not want that because you will be locked out of your server, so use discretion. Ban action, I usually use IP tables. You can also use, there's a plugin for FirewallD as well. And then the max retry, how many tries they are allowed to log in. In my case, I usually use about 5. Some people do more strict, 3. You can do less, 7, 10. This shouldn't really affect you if you're using key logins instead of password authentication. But yeah, there are a lot of other cool things you can do. You can set it to send you notifications or emails as well when there's a lockout. So really cool stuff. This is just a super base generic. And I think we forgot to use sudo, so we will do that again. One thing you can do to run the last command, super helpful if you are like me and forget to run sudo bang bang or exclamation mark, which will run the last command. So sudo bang bang will just do sudo vim etc fail to ban jail.local. And let's type that in really quick. Now that we have that squared away, we'll go ahead and enable and start the service fail to ban. I installed the package earlier, so let's get that started. And as per usual, I forgot to, just as I said it a second ago, forgot to use sudo. Alright, and double check it's running. And now we can do fail to ban client status sshd to and man, again, I'm just notorious for forgetting. So if you want to see how many IPs are banned, if anyone's been flagged, things like that, fail to ban client status sshd. If you're like me, you'll forget to sudo all the time. But that should more or less be it. Those are just the bare bones basics. Once you have this set up, your system is relatively secure. Then again, once you start installing services, configuring permissions, things like that, it gets a little bit more complex. There are definitely other things you can do to further secure your system, but this is kind of just the generic base. You know, what do I do once I set it up? How do I know it's generally secure? Should ward off the vast majority of problems. Just keep your system up to date. There are also STIGs, which are Security Technical Implementation Guides. You, in most cases, unless you work in government, won't really need those. But there are a bunch available for RHEL. I don't know if there's any for CentOS, but something if you need something more. You could also look into PCI compliance, things like that. But then again, that should more or less do it just for the basics. If you have any questions or concerns, If I didn't explain something well enough, if you would like to see more content, or you want to know further ways to secure your system, if you want to learn about configuring PAM, anything like that, user permissions, sudo permissions, other ways to track user activity, Snoopy, etc., feel free to let me know and I will be happy to create a tutorial or talk about it more. As mentioned before, the guide will also be in text format in the description on my website. A link will be there. Anyways, thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed the content and found it beneficial, please drop a like and subscribe. If you found the complete opposite, please let me know why and drop a dislike. It is how I measure how engaging I am being towards the audience, how well I'm doing with the quality of videos, etc. So thank you and have a good one.